is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, September the 20th, 2023. A few weeks ago, we did a very interesting show with Prudence Pfeiffer. She works at MoMA in New York City, and she has a book called Coenties Slip, a book about a New York street that she believes changed American art forever. In a sense, it brought modern art to New York, or maybe not modern art, maybe a certain kind of modern art. And we're following up, in a sense, on that book, although what we're about to discuss is actually took place before Coenties Slip. With my guest today, Hugh Eakin. He is the author of Picasso's War, How Modern Art Came to America. The book came out last year, and it's about to come out in paperback. It got great reviews, and it's a fascinating story. Hugh, congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
What do you think Picasso would think of paperback books versus hardback books?
Well, I don't know if he thought much of hardbacks, actually. Apparently, he was very into, comic books, stacks of old. I think paperbacks would have been his thing. I mean, you would walk into a studio and there would be, 30 years of detritus and cigarettes on the floor. So, but he was a reader, and a lot of his friends were poets. He knew many writers. In some ways, he was more close to the literary world than fellow artists, who has often had all these rivalries and complicated relationships with.
He's a controversial fellow, not so much perhaps as an artist these days, but certainly as a human being. What do you think he'd think of your book?
He probably wouldn't even acknowledge it,
Why?
Alfred Barr, the greatest Picasso man of the 20th century, builds a whole museum basically around Picasso, an entire canon of modern art, writes this definitive study of Picasso right after the war. It comes out in 1946. And then he goes and sees Picasso in the south of France. And Picasso says, "Oh, you did a really nice Matisse book," and doesn't mention that. Anyway, no, but I like to think he would have read it and silently appreciated it.
Appreciated it or loved it, or a bit of both. In contrast with Prudence, who I'm sure you know her work at least, you're not a professional art man. You actually, I think your day job is at Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy magazine?
Foreign Affairs, yeah.
Foreign Affairs. How did you get to this book as someone who works in that area? What particularly interested you? Have you always been a big Picasso man, a fan?
Well, modern art is all about foreign affairs.
Certainly for Picasso, right?
But also in the geopolitical sense. I mean, there's a huge political story as well that I'm trying to tell in this book, and I think you can't extricate the art from the politics of the time. I mean, the great battles of the 20th century, democracy and fascism and communism, that's all there, and Picasso's at the center of that. And so that's one thing. I think that there's less of a kind of separation of these fields than, or there shouldn't be, in my view. But no, I've been writing about museums and art for years as a journalist and sometime historian. So I come at it just from maybe a different angle than a museum curator.
You wrote an interesting piece in The Atlantic, which I think was borrowed in part from the book, about how, speaking of politics, his great anti-war mural, Guernica, flopped. Tell me a little bit about this work of art, when it flopped, and then the dates in terms of when he came to America.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is just one of so many instances where, in the course of writing the book, I discovered that so much of what we thought we knew, is wrong. You know, the United States was never a leader in modern art; it was a backwater. Picasso was a failure for decades before he succeeded, and the story of, his arguably best known work, Guernica, a lot of what we sort of the mythology around it is also wrong. So, you know, it springs onto the world, and there's a sense of, oh, it's this great political statement. His first big political painting against the Spanish Civil War, against the Franco the brutal Franco regime. But it's shown at the Paris Expo, and it's basically a flop. No one pays attention to it in this huge World's Fair that millions of people are in Paris. Le Corbusier has this famous quote. He said, just paraphrasing, no one saw it because they all had their backs turned. It was so bad. And so it kind of fails. And it's really not until it comes to the United States 2 years later, as the Spanish Civil War is over at that point. And
Well, by 39 it comes?
yeah, it comes in May 39. I mean, it comes to the U.S. literally when the war is ending in Spain. I mean, its original purpose is sort of over, and it has this kind of, it fails again. It tours the United States. Only a few hundred people see it. It's to raise money for Spanish refugees, and then finally it comes to MoMA, which is having this huge Picasso show, and only then does it really kind of attain this kind of stature that it will later have as the kind of definitive 20th century political painting. But it's full of contingency, and all, like so many other parts of this story, so many things could have gone a different way. It could have been rolled up, and if it had not come to the United States, we might not know Guernica. It might be that work that, a Miro that showed with Guernica in Paris in 1937 was shipped back to Spain and then lost. So this could have happened to Guernica, but Guernica went to Picasso's studio instead, because the Spanish Republicans for whom it was made disdained it so much they didn't want it. They said, "Okay, just take it back." They had commissioned it. So it's a very interesting story, and I think tells us a lot about sort of, how contingent this is.
And it's in an odd way, it's appropriate, because contingency and Picasso's art seem to go together. It's almost reassuring to me that everyone, to borrow your language, turned their back on Picasso, or his work at least at first. Isn't that reassuring? Doesn't that remind us that it takes a while for, I be careful about using the phrase great art, but if there is a great artist, it's probably Picasso. It's not obvious. It's not immediate.
No, not at all. I mean, the great, the kind of iconic Picasso paintings that we think of, Demoiselle d'Avignon, another example. Everyone hated that. Picasso's friends hated that. Georges Braque, his fellow in arms in Cubism, sees Demoiselle for the first time, and he's like, "This is like drinking gasoline." I mean, he just hates it. And it disappeared. Picasso didn't show it. He kept it in his studio for many years. It has a very belated story, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, we have to get back to what it was like to actually encounter this art that we sort of just accept as kind of part of the firmament today. And it was, in fact, not just radical, but kind of distasteful and, at a time when images didn't circulate. We didn't have access to just endless images of everything around us. It was the shock of encountering something so, the great Russian collector Sergei Shukin, when he saw Picasso, the first Cubist work, he said it was like swallowing broken glass.
It's the shock of the new.
It's the shock of the new, but it's also a sense of rupture, that all the kind of values, there's a much more of a sense of a kind of existing value.
A breakage, which is what the art's about anyway. So it's doubly shocking, or doubly like eating broken glass or drinking gasoline. This wasn't that unusual, though, Hugh, was it? I mean, we all know the story of everyone walking out on Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. This was, in some senses, a tradition for the avant-garde in Europe.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it's kind of both ways. I mean, we had our own Rite of Spring, which was the Armory show in 1913, which is also kind of this, in the kind of tradition, it's this heroic moment when, overnight, sort of by shock and awe, all this modern art arrives in the United States. And yeah, people are horrified, but it's this turning point. And from that point on, the United States is modern, and New York is the center of kind of modern art. I mean, that's kind of, I'm drawing a caricature, but that's kind of the standard view. And what I discovered was, in fact, the Armory show was in its own way kind of a flop. It created a huge amount of attention, but it was also, the whole purpose of it was to sell this new art, to go straight to the consumer. You could buy anything from the show, and in fact, hardly anybody bought from the show.
Yeah, it's somewhat, I don't know, ironic or chilling, or something slightly troubling that you write about Picasso coming to America in 1939. And of course, in 1939, it was Nazi troops arriving throughout the rest of Europe. America wasn't really preoccupied with that, though, in 1939. What happened back then to make them to awake America? I mean, I'm sure it's not all Americans, but some Americans, to Picasso's work, to Picasso's art.
Yeah, so Picasso didn't come to the, I mean,
no, I understand his work did, though.
Yeah, but no, that's a great point. I mean, in 1939, it's this kind of disjuncture, the United States is finally coming out of the Depression. It's like the economy is picking up, and actually the initial effect of the war is like, well, we can sell more airplanes to the British and the French, and so there was this big economic recovery. Hollywood is booming. 1939 is one of the great years of Hollywood. American culture. It's not really a moment when Europe is sort of super high on the agenda. And it's interesting that there are two World's Fairs in the United States in the summer of 1939. So weeks before the start of the war, you have the New York World's Fair, and you also have the Golden Gate Expo in San Francisco. Yeah. And these two expos are all about celebrating like world peace and, America's new position in the world. And they have these pavilions. Mussolini sends over a bunch of Renaissance art for the first time to tour the United States, and so there's a kind of a belated awakening to the war, and this all kind of comes to a head in the fall of 1939, and that's sort of precisely the sort of the climax of this story when the Picasso show is supposed to take place. And this is all planned before the war. All this stuff has to get to the United States. Shipping lanes are suddenly shut down as of September 1st. And, three musicians, one of the great Picasso paintings is on a boat to Buenos Aires. And so all these paintings have to be kind of gathered at this geopolitical explosion and safely brought to the United States. So that's sort of part of the story.
And when people saw Guernica, um, the work, was it interpreted as a statement against war, as an attack on fascism, as a comment on the Spanish Civil War, or just as art, modern art, whatever that means?
Well, I think it was such an unapproachable work of art for so many. I mean, it's hard to kind of get back to what your sort of typical, even informed American viewer in 1939 would never have seen a lot of, you know, sort of cubism forward, and suddenly this not just this astonishing political statement, but much more so a kind of radical. You know, no one had done a mural on this scale using, you know, this kind of, you know, complex kind of amalgam of all these different parts of Picasso's sort of thought and work of the past quarter century. And so I think that the kind of war message is almost in the background, especially in the United States. You know, the Spanish Civil War is come to a close. It does become this kind of searing statement against war itself, and I think that there's a kind of effort on the part of, I mean, the way it's curated and presented in this great Picasso show in 1939, it's the kind of culmination. So you're kind of walked through all the different phases of Picasso's career, and then you come to this room and it's all by itself, and there it is. And meanwhile, Alfred Barr, I mean, this is the political angle of the whole story. You know, he has spent the previous decade making the argument that modern art is American, and that, you know, this is a man who, you know, is probably the only American who witnessed totalitarianism in, he witnessed Stalin come to power in the Soviet Union, and then Hitler come to power. You know, he happens to be in Germany in the spring of 1933, and in the back of his mind, these are the two regimes that are against, you know, modern art, and so America therefore has to be for modern art, and this becomes this great argument about freedom, that he makes, and he makes the case that it's not this, you know, European, you know, kind of hothouse bohemian thing that Americans need to stay away from, but it's about freedom, it's about democracy, and that was sort of an interesting, you know, FDR at the, you know, by the end of the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt himself is giving a speech about the importance of modern art, as kind of part of the arsenal of democracy. So it's an interesting kind of shift that has to take place.
Yeah, and I want to talk more. We're going to take a short break, Hugh, now. I'll talk more about Alfred Barr, FDR, the politics of modern art, the pretense of modern art, Picasso, of course. But I want to remind everyone that this show is brought to you by Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. We'll be back in 2 seconds to talk more with Hugh Eakin about the remarkable story of when Picasso brought modern art, in a sense, literally and metaphorically, to America. We'll be back in a second.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can check out more, libertiesjournal.com. You can also subscribe online to the excellent quarterly. We are speaking with Hugh Eakin, who is the author of Picasso's work. Came out last year. Wonderful book. It's just coming out in paperback next week. Hugh, before the break, you talked a little bit about somebody called Alfred Barr. I have to admit, I didn't know about him until I came across your book. Tell me about him and why he's so central in this narrative.
Well, Alfred Barr was the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art. but that's kind of the short of the story. I mean, the Museum of Modern Art was a thing that didn't exist. So there wasn't such a thing as a museum of art. They collected art of living artists, let alone this new modern art in the United States. This is the era of the great, historic museums like the Met and the Chicago Art Institute. They are kind of encyclopedic museums emulating the great art collections of Europe of the past, but also collecting antiquities from around the world. And they collected what they called modern art, but they were thinking of like French academic painting, Bouguereau, and nothing really much forward from the mid 19th century. So the whole concept was new, and there was no expertise. There was no you couldn't go to study modern art. It was hard to get it. In the United States, most of the great European modern artists their work were in collections in Europe, and there were a handful of collectors. And so there's this kid, this kind of wunderkind who comes along, and he is kind of, as so many of the characters in the story, kind of an outsider. He's a preacher's son, but he scholarship kid to Princeton, and he's just kind of wild about art, and he quickly decides that there's nothing. He has this famous thing. He's applying for a graduate school, and he writes, I really don't think the Quattrocento, Italian Renaissance art has any, holds a candle to to modern art. And he didn't get any funding, but so he's this sort of solitary figure in the 1920s, and he's picked by these 3 society women in New York to run this museum. They said, we need to have a museum. New York is behind. It's behind the rest of the world. By the late 1920s, every city in Europe has a modern art museum. Where is it in the United States? So he's chosen at this incredibly young age to run this museum, and his other task is to build an actual collection, and that takes years and years because for one thing, there's no money, but also there's no agreement on who are the artists, who should we be collecting, and how radical could they be. Even these well-meaning founders were not very far into Cubism. So it took this kind of incredible effort. And the other fascinating thing about Alfred Barr is he's fascinated by military history, and he thinks in military terms, which is very interesting. In the 1930s, he's on these campaigns. He describes every summer he and Marga, his wife, go to Paris and travel around Europe on their latest campaign. And they're gonna, this year they're gonna do Matisse, and then it's Picasso, and the Cubists, and then the Surrealists, and then it's actually a campaign also for American legitimacy. And so he's this extraordinary figure, which is who forms kind of a counterpoint to Picasso throughout this story. It's not clear that they ever became very warm friends, which is also interesting.
One president in the 1920s said that the business of America is business, and of course, America in the 1930s and 1920s was the engine of global capitalism, of the marketplace. We did a show last year with Charles Delheim. I'm sure you're familiar with his book on belonging and betrayal, how Jews made the art world modern. It's a book about the modern art world and the business of the art world. Were there speculators, business people who recognized in the 1930s, if not necessarily with Picasso himself, but with quote unquote modern art, that there were massive fortunes to be made if you bought the right paintings at the right time?
It's so interesting. I mean, I think that this again is one of the things that I feel like the mythology has distorted the story. So I mean, it was one of the results of Alfred Barr's success that he fought for years against these powerful dealers who essentially controlled the modern art market. And they didn't really compete with museums because museums didn't really have the stature. I mean, it was kind of like it is today. I mean, you want to see really a big sort of very cutting edge show, you would go to, one of the big New York galleries more than any of the museums, because they do big shows. They have curators, they have catalogs. That's how it was in the 20s. These big dealers in Paris, where you could make a lot of money off of modern art, they did, immaculate shows with, the best art historian in France would do, Toulouse-Lautrec, curate a Toulouse-Lautrec show for the Rosenberg Gallery. But there wasn't any sort of museum competition because they just weren't in the game in the same way. And we've kind of come back to that point today. But so there's a huge amount of money in it. But the sort of the paradox is that in the United States, there was very little value placed on this new art because it didn't have this pedigree. And I think there's a lot of insecurity there that, the sort of titanic figures of the period, the J.P. Morgans, the William Clay Fricks, Isabella Stewart Gardner at the turn of the century, the whole idea was appropriating the kind of European past, and the irony. So the United States is this rising new world power, but it needed all this sort of old art for legitimacy. Whereas, Germany, or these old world countries, Germany, Russia, Soviet, even before the end of the Tsarist era, you have these, very avant-garde collections being formed in Moscow. They weren't concerned about that. They didn't need kind of historic legitimacy.
I'm guessing, I'm pretty sure that Picasso deeply offended the Nazis. I'm sure he offended the Stalinists as well. I'm sure that Picasso's work wasn't available in Moscow in the 30s or Berlin in the 1930s. Did he offend people here, given the culture wars that existed as much in the 1930s as they do in the 2020s? The isolationists, people hostile to American association with Europe, people hostile to modernity, people hostile to creative people of other ethnicities and sexualities.
Oh yeah, certainly, and that's kind of what Barr is fighting against throughout the 30s, and especially in the 30s. There is this kind of isolationism, but there's also this kind of nativism, and the art that is really being pushed, including by the Roosevelt administration, which is interesting. We think of the WPA, the Roosevelt employing all these American artists to paint murals in public buildings at the height of the Depression. But that was also part of this whole kind of American art. We're going to support all these great kind of native talent that had nothing to do with these new European art movements. This was going to be our new, our American homegrown. The kind of muralist style, Thomas Hart Benton, these kind of virile figures who painted, people, real people doing, American quotidian life. And there was a real effort to kind of portray, the whole Picasso thing in Paris as kind of this crackpot, decadent, deviant, and that's the other thing that I think is really was for me one of the more astonishing discoveries. So we think of the kind of the Nazi idea of kind of the effort to portray modern art as this kind of deviancy that has to be purged from all these German museums. That this whole this idea of degenerate art and showing the public these are horrors that you have to destroy. Actually, all of that comes from the United States. You go back a generation in the around the time of the Armory show in the teens. You have all this writing in the United States about warning about degenerate art from Europe, and there was a lot of anxiety about, this would be some kind of civilization destroying.
Well, did the quote unquote reactionary political movements of the 30s, the Lindberghs, the isolationists, did they catch on to this? Did they associate the work of somebody like Picasso as a form of degeneracy, culturally, politically, intellectually?
It's kind of a gray. It's shifting all the time in those years in the late 30s, and there is. I mean, if you look sort of officially, you do have kind of this shift at the end of the 30s where Roosevelt is finally the administration that supported this kind of American tradition is also getting behind European modernism, but it's a very tenuous hold even then. And there's this moment when Barr, he's offered this group of German expressionist paintings. These are the very paintings that Hitler has purged from German museums. And there's this traveling show, and he turns it down because he says he doesn't think the art is good enough. And he's like, some people looking at this, they might think that Hitler was right. So he's hyper aware.
He didn't really say that, did he, Hugh? I mean, not literally.
No, he really did.
But I guess this was before the Holocaust. So
yeah. This is. He's not referring to the Holocaust. He's referring to Hitler's
war. What about American artists? I was just at the Ansel Adams exhibit, wonderful exhibit in San Francisco. When one thinks of American artists, photographers, cinematographers, many of them were emigres anyway from Germany or from Europe. I mean, Adams, of course, wasn't. What was the reaction amongst American avant-garde creative artists, photographers, filmmakers, writers to Picasso?
Well, the response is really interesting because you already have this debate going on in the 20s. I mean, in art circles, there are sort of the modernists and the Americanists, and they're sort of battling it out. And you have people like Stuart Davis who are have heavily interested in what's happening in Europe, and then the Thomas Hart Bentons in the other camp saying we need to reject all of this this kind of these European influences. But in the kind of pivotal turning point with this big show, I mean, one of the other key sort of thing about it is that it can travel. It's not like an exhibition that was shown in New York and then it's shut. It traveled all over the country, and because of the war, all those loans in the show never had to go back because they couldn't go back. We were stuck in the United States. So this show, lasted for almost the entire war.
Oh, incredible. So where was it mostly? Was it always on show?
It was frequently on show. There were 3 different tours. It went to something like 24 American cities. I mean, name a city that it didn't go. There were also requests from Toronto, and it didn't ultimately go to Canada, but it did go to Mexico, which is astonishing. Mexico City in 1944.
Although there would have been more sensitivity there, given that it's a piece of work about the Spanish Civil War.
The Guernica did not go to Mexico City, but parts of the show that there were sort of different iterations depending on what material could travel. And so no, I mean, it's an astonishing story. And again, it's contingency. Because of the war, the art has to keep on tour, and because of the tour, it had this national reaction rather than just New York and Chicago, which was the original plan. So people in New Orleans saw it, people in Portland saw it,
Anyone in St. Paul? You're talking to me from St. Paul. Did it show up in Minnesota?
Yes, Minneapolis in the winter of 1941, and there's a great series of in the kind of museum magazine that their museum members got for like 3 months in preparation. They had all of these sort of "Don't be scared of Picasso" articles, kind of preparing viewers for this shocking event. Yeah, literally hundreds of thousands of people from all parts of the country took in this show, and I think that really was had a catalytic effect that wouldn't have been possible, including artists. I would have to double check this, but I think like Roy Lichtenstein saw it in Chicago. People like Pollock and Louise Bourgeois saw it in New York, and other people saw it in California. It was just it was catalytic in a way that few shows arguably could be, just sheerly by geography.
The subtitle of the book is How Modern Art Came to America, rather than how Pablo Picasso came to America. He, of course, is an enormously controversial figure. He's had a number of lives in America in terms of his reputation, and particularly his behavior towards women. Was there any interest in Picasso himself when this modern art came to America, or was he just seen as some sort of weird European artist?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that you're right, you see more and more controversial by the year, but the interest itself doesn't seem to wane. It's interesting. It's as if we're back to the beginning, where he's become almost as controversial as he was when he first when his work was
right. He's become the controversy rather than his work,
right. rather than the art, which is not so perplexing and is so ubiquitous that. But on a side note, I mean, one of the interesting things about the stories are that there were important, both Barr's wife, Marga, and the sort of collector who's in the first part of the story, John Quinn, had this brilliant companion named Jean Foster, and these two women were as much involved as the men in this story. And in the story of the Museum of Modern Art, it really is women who are ahead of the game. The conservative forces in New York are the kind of financier class, who are all these sort of male collectors, and it's actually the women. Abby Rockefeller has to hide her Matisses in the nursery of the seven-story Rockefeller mansion, because John D. Rockefeller Jr. He couldn't stand to look at modern art. So there is actually this very interesting counterpoint to this narrative that of misogyny, which is that it's really women that are a part of the sort of first broad group of appreciators of this art. But I'm sorry, I've strayed from your question.
Well, it's good to stray from my questions. The more you stray, the better you become, Hugh. Let's end by going back to the beginning, to American art. I noted The Slip, Prudence Pfeiffer's book about American modern art after the Second World War, the New York street that changed American art forever. What happened? In terms, you say that Picasso or his work changed American art. Did he invent modern art? Were all these young people just artists going to this thing, wow, this is incredible, I need to get back and reinvent myself as an artist?
Well, I mean, there is a real sense that once you've sort of absorbed his work, there was no going back.
Right.
There was no more before Picasso, after you see Picasso. So all of these artists had to take account of it in some way, and they say that they say that themselves. There's this great anecdote Lee Krasner says about Jackson Pollock, that at some point he he's sitting in his studio and he's flipping through the catalog of the 1939 Picasso show, and he says, "God damn it!" and he throws the book across the room. It says something like that. That guy thought of everything. So he's reacting as well. And I think it's not so much that there's influence, that everybody wants to be Picasso, but that there's a sense of this is a jolt that cannot be.
Yes, it's like a major culture. It's like, I don't know, listening to the White Album or some other major, I mean, probably a bigger deal than listening to the White Album, but some sort of major cultural event. You can't go back. So ironically, are you suggesting that even if America was a bit behind, a bit provincial, a bit reactionary in the 30s, Picasso actually did make America in an odd way the leader? Because after the Second World War, America did pioneer much modern art, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the irony of the whole thing. You know, here's Picasso, never visits the United States in his entire career. You know, ends up a communist and he's this kind of larger than life figure that flips the American art world. And you know, after the war, where are all the great Picassos? Well, they're all in the United States in American museums. And where is the art world? It's in the United States. Where are the big dealers who ran the world in Paris before the war? They're all in New York. And you know, so it's this amazing kind of story that he's at the center of, but also, you know, in a way indifferent too. It's sort of fascinating that, you know, he never, you know, he kind of orchestrates this, and yet you know, he's the missing figure in the whole thing.
Yeah, I sense with you a little bit of ambivalence and maybe even a nostalgia for the time before Picasso brought the modern art world to America. Okay.
Well, it depends. It depends which aspect of the modern art world.
Well, all the hype and the nonsense and the money and the hypocrisy. I mean, especially given the nature of art, which is supposed to expose all that stuff.
I mean, it's really fascinating. You go back to that very first show. So the first Picasso show in the United States, 1911, was actually astonishingly early. So there was this opportunity, you know, in this tiny gallery in New York, and it's just drawings, no paintings, because they couldn't, you know, there was no money in modern art at the time. So this, you know, tiny gallery is bringing over a group of Cubist drawings, and one of the figures in my book, you know, important, ultimately a great Picasso collector. This is his first encounter with Picasso, and he says, you know, you can, when you look at Picasso, you see he doesn't care what the public thinks. He just has no interest at all. And there was this sense of that sort of unbridled, kind of unleashed radicalism that, you know, they did what they wanted, and it wasn't market driven. And of course, that may not have been the Picasso of 1950. But it's interesting that modern art in itself kind of became its own demise in terms of at least the kind of the underlying kind of heroic values that started it off.
It's become almost like elevator music. Is there any original art left, Hugh? Or do we have to look in other fields? Is that done, that space?
I mean, it's pretty hard. I have to say, it's pretty hard. I mean, I think we're in an age also of rediscovery, and I mean, one of the great things is there's always some really great work, even recent modern work, you know, that you know nobody appreciated, and that suddenly can be recovered. I think the very contemporary moment that we're in is a very strange one. I mean, you have a tiny group of artists who are, you know, with these kind of valuations that are like, you know, like the Chinese real estate market or something, with no bearing. I mean, it's in no relationship to kind of aesthetic quality. It's become a market in itself. I mean,
speculative mania, like NFTs.
Yeah. So But as far as elevator music goes, I mean, it's pretty good music. I